The Milky Way came out at a very strange time in history. I know, I was there. I wrote an early review of it. I remember how odd it felt. This was in the aftermath of, or in the midst of really the revolutionary upsurge of 1968-69. And the whole of Europe was up in flames with people arguing, fighting, taking to the streets. It was an odd time for Buñuel to be making a film so apparently divorced from anything in the 20th century. Why was he doing this? And so it had a rough ride. There were people who said it was like, propaganda for the Catholic Church. Many people were very disappointed that they felt that the old surrealist had finally sort of hung up his boots and showed disturbing signs, perhaps, of falling back into what he'd been against for the whole of his life, which was the authority of the Catholic Church. Of course, that was a silly reaction. We know that now. But I think it took real effort to decode what Buñuel was about. And I think for many people, the film wasn't that rewarding at a first viewing for them to want to make the effort. I think maybe the first thing to say about The Milky Way is that it's a very confusing film. It's a film which obviously has a lot of different narrative levels running through it, and it's not obvious how they're connected. I think the best way to understand this is to go back to Buñuel himself and to take exactly what he said literally. Buñuel says in his memoir that one of his favorite films is a film called The Saragossa Manuscript. And The Saragossa Manuscript is one of these real curiosities. It appears to be set in the interminable wars that were going on in the Iberian Peninsula. A young nobleman, a young officer, comes across a manuscript and starts to read. And we are plunged back into the story that he's reading. And in the story he's reading, somebody else tells the story, and we go into that story. And before we know it, we're 3 or 4 layers down in a story within a story within a story. Then we come back up through the layers, and then the stories start to interconnect. All of that, I think, fascinated Buñuel, absolutely fascinated him. He loved the film. He said he saw it 3 times, which is very unusual for him. And I think we can see a bit of a tribute to the Saragossa manuscript in The Milky Way. This idea of a multi-level, multi-strand film, which Buñuel attempted in The Milky Way, is very similar to what other filmmakers of quite different kinds were doing at the end of the 1960s. It has something to do with Alain Resnais and his experiments with narrative in Hiroshima, Mon Amour, and in L'année dernière à Marienbad. It has something to do with Godard, as Godard moves towards very complex narratives with Made in USA, and especially in Weekend. And in fact, I think one of the models for La Voie Lactée might be the final part of Weekend, where you do have a sort of allegorical landscape with characters in costume from history who are walking past like sort of embodied quotations, reading from their own works, and making this a sort of literalized version of an anthology of famous sayings and philosophies of the past. He said he'd always been influenced by the great Spanish picaresque novels, and this is truly a picaresque film. Now, a picaresque novel is one where the hero wanders through a landscape and has lots of interesting encounters. Here we have 2 heroes who do indeed wander through a landscape and have a series of encounters. That's exactly what happens in the film. The problem, in a way, is that the encounters don't seem to be happening in the same space and time. At one moment, they're encountering people who seem to be somewhere in the 4th century, having a religious ritual in the forest. At another time, they seem to be intersecting with scenes from the life of Christ. The idea of having a modern story interwoven with the life of Christ is not so unusual. There are other examples of that. One of the most famous is Bulgakov's great novel, The Master and Margarita, where modern scenes in Russia in the 20th century are intercut with scenes from the life of Christ. So there are lots of background sources, models that Buñuel and Jean-Claude Carrière could have used in constructing the film. One of the other clues we have about the film is, again, what Buñuel and Carrière say they did, which is they read A History of Heresy. Now, that's probably the most difficult area for a modern secular audience. Who knows about heresy today except people who've read A History of Heresy? It's a pretty obscure subject, and yet it's something which meant a great deal to Buñuel as a Spanish Catholic. He had grown up in a corner of Europe where that sense of the life or death struggle between different sects, different groups, was still a lived reality for many people in his generation. Spain, of course, had been the home of the Inquisition, which had tortured and killed people over doctrines and articles of faith. So we shouldn't be surprised, perhaps, that heresy really means something. But I think what interests Buñuel is not the literal difference between this heresy versus that heresy and what the bishop of this did and what the council of that said. That would all be merely academic stuff. What heresy means for him is a kind of metaphor, I think, for human beings' fascination with arguing about the immaterial and the invisible and trying to bolt it down and make it literal. So here we have in the film the sublime absurdity of people having theological arguments about, the Eucharist or the Immaculate Conception or all of those doctrines of the Catholic Church, and they're arguing about them as if they were matters of fact, as if they were things that you could say, yes, it's this way, or no, it's that way.
Oui, je sens que le corps du Christ est contenu dans l'hostie, comme le lièvre dans ce pâté, j'en suis sûr, absolument sûr.
Mais vous venez de dire le contraire.
J'ai dit le contraire, moi.
Et oui, vous.
I don't think any of the original viewers of the Milky Way could possibly have understood most of the references. I remember distinctly when the film was press shown in Britain, you got notes with it that gave you a sort of bluffer's guide to what the main reference points were. So I think the distributors knew perfectly well that this was not common knowledge. This was the time when people knew quite a lot about the heroes of socialism and of the left. They knew about Althusser, perhaps, and about Karl Marx, but did they know about obscure heretics of the 4th and 5th century? I think not. And I think Buñuel would have understood that. And what he's doing is using this as a set of mysteries, which the film, to some extent, initiates you into. The central mystery that runs through the film, or the central heresy, is known as Priscillianism, named after the bishop Priscillian, who was a 4th century bishop. And it's one of those heresies, official heresies, that clustered around that time, which are all sort of manifestations of something that has become better known since, actually, which is Gnosticism. Gnosticism was the fundamental problem that the early church had to deal with. There were a bunch of people who kept rising up in different parts of Europe, saying that the church had actually got it all wrong. Instead of there being a sort of God's dispensation, as the church interpreted it, there were really two fundamental forces in the universe: darkness and light, spirituality and matter. It's also the Manichaean heresy. That's another term that is perhaps better known, where there is good and bad, just. And according to these cluster of heresies, there is this opposition between these two principles, whatever you call them, which is long-standing, since before the beginning of time. It also calls into question the creation as narrated in the traditional Bible. The church regarded all of these heresies as something that had to be stamped out, because if the faithful, the believers, started to get confused and believed that there might be something in the Gnostic heresies, then of course the authority of the church would be lost, and the whole unity of the church would splinter into 1,000 different sects. So from about the 4th century onwards, the church began to take an almost military attitude towards stamping out heresy. And there was a great deal of rounding up, calling to trial, imprisoning, and eventually, of course, putting to death various sorts of heretics. So all of that is something of the background. I don't think anybody who hadn't gone and looked it up, frankly, or hadn't studied theology or church history could possibly have known that. But I think you don't need to know that, because what you see in the film, when you come across the very first sort of scene of heresy in action, what you see is the scene of a mystery being celebrated in the forest. These are clearly mystics. There are people on the run who are conducting a mystery. And you feel that sense of danger, that sense of excitement, which attaches to any secret society. It's like a secret society, which has its own rules and regulations. For Buñuel, it matters that it's true and authentic. And although he often plays with religion as one way of reaching mystery, there's something beyond that. There is something deeply, irreducibly mysterious. And even when Buñuel's poking fun at the absurdities of, bourgeois behavior, the absurdities of the Marquis de Sade, the absurdities of surrealism, even when he's poking fun at them, he's reaching out for something, you feel, which lies beyond. And there are moments, I think, in La Voie Lactée, which I think is why it's a tremendously important film to understand his work as a whole, where you do sense that you're on the edge of a mystery. When the two pilgrims meet Alain Cuny at the beginning of their pilgrimage, this is a very strange moment. It's something which you can't explain away. This is like one of those absolutely mystical meetings that can change someone's life. And when they meet the prostitute at the end, which is the closing, the sort of bookend of the film, there's also that sense that something has happened. Now, this is set against the background of the traditional pilgrimage to Santiago, the 800 kilometers, I think it is, Pilgrim's Way, which has been pursued by pilgrims from time immemorial. Traditionally, in a pilgrimage, you undertake the pilgrimage to purge yourself of sins and to receive a blessing. The two pilgrims have undertaken this pilgrimage. Why? We're never quite sure. He wants to shake up the viewers, not only the viewers who are confirmed atheists, but maybe that whole range of possible viewers who will be disturbed by what they've seen and may want to interpret it in different ways, because in the end, the film doesn't give us any single interpretation. It forces us to make our own choice amongst the possible layers of the story that we want to identify with. I think you could say that the Milky Way marks a real turning point in Buñuel's conception of how to build a film. Up to that point, most of his films have been linear stories. In fact, often they're sort of breakneck stories, which are told at high speed using voiceover. Something then begins to happen in the course of the 60s. The most obvious sign of that, I suppose, is Simon of the Desert, a short film in which we are back in this, we're in this religious territory, which will be revisited in the Milky Way. And then suddenly the central character, Simon Stylites, is whisked into the modern world and we get a time jump. Now, nothing like that has really happened in Buñuel's narrative films of the middle period before. So that already is the first sign of a change in attitude. The Milky Way, seen in retrospect, now that we know what came after it, and Buñuel didn't know he was going to go on to have a developing career. He thought it might be near the end of his time as a filmmaker. The Milky Way inaugurates something which is this multi-strand narrative where characters walk into one story, out of that story, into another story. The most famous example of that, of course, is Belle de Jour. And in Belle de Jour, we have 3 different levels of narrative all happening. And the relationship between them is never absolutely clear. We make our own hypothesis, which is not as mystifying as the Milky Way, but still it's a film which retains a sense of mystery. Thereafter, the films would become more and more ingenious and complicated. In The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie and The Phantom of Liberty, we get what became the recognizable later style of Buñuel, which is these wonderfully slippery films in which the charm and presence of the actors carries us through a completely surreal, absurd landscape. Actually, they're easier, I think, to cope with because they're full of narrative surprises, full of ironies, full of jokes, in a way that the Milky Way is not. The Milky Way is much spikier as a film. We're never quite sure whether Buñuel is taking seriously these episodes. Occasionally the carpet is pulled from under a particular episode, but very often we're a little uncertain about whether, in fact, we're meant to understand more than we do. And what we see in Buñuel's work is a constant kicking against the forces of authority. We know in some of the earlier films how he would attack the church because of its power over people, because of its hypocrisy as a rich institution, condemning many of its members to poverty. He's constantly on the lookout for alliances between the military, the police, and the church. These are familiar scenes from earlier Buñuel films. But in the Milky Way, I think there's something else going on. There he really wants to penetrate to the heart of what makes the church fascinating. He wants to question its beliefs, and at the same time he wants to ask, what do beliefs mean? And I suppose if we had to find some level for interpreting the film, we'd have to say that it's about a couple of rogues who find themselves living in several different time zones simultaneously, rather like we do today, because of course we live in the past through our access to the beliefs of the past. And they're trying to make sense of the world. They're not trying to make sense of it in an intellectual way, they're trying to survive. But in that sense, they're a sort of everyman character. And we could relate that back to the most famous picaresque novel of all, Don Quixote, in which Quixote himself has his head full of fanciful ideas taken from the great romances about chivalric knights. But his sidekick, his squire, Sancho Panza, just wants to know where the next meal is coming from. Well, the two central characters in La Voie Lactée are much closer to Sancho Panza. They want to know where the next meal, the next bed, the next purse to rob is coming from. But at the same time, they are in a world, a forest of symbols, a landscape of strange beliefs which are causing people to act in unpredictable and ferocious ways. Buñuel and Carrière also take us into the one of the great disputes of the 17th, 18th century, which is the schism that developed within Catholicism, particularly in France, between what were known as the Jansenists and the Jesuits. And this is really, it's almost like a kind of outbreak of Protestantism within the Catholic Church. There had been the great schism, which had given birth to Protestantism as a protest against Catholicism, earlier with Luther and the other Protestants. But within Catholicism itself, in the later years of the Ancien Régime in France, there was a very intense outbreak of a kind of ultra-Catholicism, which was very ascetic, which was against the worldliness that the Church had developed. The Catholic Church in France, as in Italy, had become a very worldly temporal power. It had its princes, it had its palaces, its riches. It was behaving like a sort of a nation on earth. For the Jansenists, this was absolutely the opposite of Christ's teaching, and they wanted to return the church to something much simpler, much more spiritual. The best known example of the Jansenist ideology, I suppose, is Pascal. And Pascal's position, his stripping away of all the externals of religion to a kind of pure wager between the individual and God, Pascal's famous wager. That's a kind of very clear expression of the Jansenist belief that really religion should be between you as an individual and God, not mediated through the church. And so, of course, this was a matter of enormous dispute and of real conflict within France. And so Buñuel and Carrière play this out as a duel. We see a fight going on between Jesuit and Jansenist. It's a way of making literal what was a doctrinal dispute. And there is this note at the end of the film which tells us that everything in the film is absolutely accurate. It's a kind of joke in a way, because what Buñuel has shown is that he's constructed a completely surreal narrative by taking the history of heresy and the history of the church absolutely at face value.
C'est une erreur semi-pélagienne de soutenir que Jésus-Christ est mort généralement pour tous les hommes.
Vous faites injure à la bonté divine. Le Christ est mort pour obtenir à tous les hommes les secours suffisants relativement au salut.
The Surrealists had their gallery of heroes. When they launched in the mid-1920s, they very quickly constructed a whole gallery of key figures that they pulled out of history and turned into their own saints. And central to those was the figure of the Marquis de Sade. The Marquis de Sade, who was a nobleman under the Ancien Régime in France, had spent most of his life in prison for his scandalous writings. And in fact, he was so scandalous that very few people in the modern world had ever read de Sade, because most of his books were still banned. They were known as philosophical novels at the time, in which usually the heroine undergoes outrageous torture and dreadful use at the hands of people who should be her guardians. They're full of minute descriptions of physical torture, of violation, of rape, branding, killing, all of which is being conducted in de Sade's universe in the name of a relentless search for truth and an opposition to religion and to the traditional beliefs of the state. So de Sade takes what became known as libertinage, or the philosophy of the libertines, to an ultimate extreme. He denies all authority except the absolute obligation to pursue pleasure, however far it leads. Now, this is pretty subversive stuff. And for the surrealists, putting de Sade on a pedestal was a part of their campaign of provocation to say surrealism isn't just an art movement, it's a new way to live. It's a way to reject all authority in pursuit of the principles of surrealism. So they regarded de Sade as a kind of ancestor. And Buñuel talks a lot in his memoirs about de Sade and about his great desire to make a film about de Sade. He wanted for a long time to make a film of a great British Gothic novel, The Monk, which is very, very influenced by de Sade's ideas. Robert Darnton, who's an historian of this period, has written a lot about how there's a strange mixture between this libertine writing, these pornographic novels of the 18th century, and the rise of the Enlightenment, of the new philosophy of the Enlightenment. And there is a strange way in which a novel like Thérèse was both a dirty book, it's a genuinely pornographic novel, and yet it's full of challenges to the ideology of the state and of established religion. It's perhaps hard for us to understand, although there are examples of that perhaps in the writing of William Burroughs and some of the famous pornographers of the 20th century, Georges Bataille, for instance, who was also a surrealist, who wrote the story of the Eye. These kind of texts, again in the 20th century, show how there is a sort of alliance to be struck between works that are disturbing because they move us in a very frank physical way that literature isn't supposed to, and they stir us intellectually. They provoke, they cause you to doubt the things that you thought you knew and believed in. Part of Buñuel's own background is his immersion in surrealist history and theory, and his fascination as a Spaniard with the history of heresy. Mostly that's kind of submerged beneath the surface of the film, but in this film, in particular, it comes to the fore. And I think it's very disconcerting because you keep asking yourselves, am I supposed to really know exactly what's going on? No, you're not, I think, but you are meant to understand and meant to participate in the cut and thrust of debates that seem to be quite abstract, but are really, of course, shown to be the things that people live by. It's very important we understand that these are beliefs that drive people mad, drive them to commit murder, drive them to do the most terrible things. We are in the realm of fanaticism, and where there is doctrine and belief and the will to enforce that, so there is also heresy. You can map this onto the political field, you can map it onto the conflict between religions today. For Buñuel is doing it in terms of the Catholic Church and its centuries-long efforts to stamp out heresy. It's about power, and it's about the power of beliefs to drive people to unbelievable lengths. That's what he wants us to understand. One of the great ironies about the making of the Milky Way is the fact that it actually happened across the events of May 68 in France. This is a film which was certainly begun before anyone could have known that the uprising of students and the workers' strikes would have led to what many people believed really was a kind of new French Revolution happening. And Buñuel, of course, looked at this with a curious mixture of we've been here before, and at the same time some real enthusiasm for the events. For him, it was like a replay of everything that surrealism had tried to bring about in the 1920s. He noted with amusement that some of the slogans that were being daubed up on the walls of Paris were exactly surrealist slogans. Be realistic, demand the impossible. It is forbidden to forbid. These wonderful slogans were brought up, if you like, out of the culture of surrealism, and they had a new lease of life. They became the political slogans of the students' and workers' movement of May 68, influenced also by another movement called situationism, which was a a challenge to the society of the spectacle and of consumerism. There was a profoundly sort of anti-materialistic drive behind those events of May 68. And Buñuel thought, how sweet in a way. They're repeating all of those things we thought in the 1920s. I suppose he felt that it wouldn't lead anywhere, that the revolution was never going to be achieved. And even if it was achieved, it would probably turn into a tyranny. So he was that far removed from the barricades. But as an old surrealist, he was also stirred by the visible signs of a new revolt against consumer society. And so I think that gave him a sort of new belief in the message of the film, and maybe it helped to sharpen the film and give the film its drive towards what I believe is a sort of plague on all your houses approach, because it is very, very challenging to a whole range of beliefs. And it ends with a very enigmatic scene in which Christ and the disciples are striding on, and there are two blind beggars feeling their way forward. I don't think there's a single unequivocal reading of that scene. The way I interpret it is that he very definitely wants us to understand that Christianity is not about making things good and nice. It's about sowing dissension. It's about setting man against his brother. And that's certainly how it has been. It's also not necessarily about just being nice to those who are unfortunate. There's a ruthless side to Christianity. And Buñuel has shown this in his other films too. And I think what we see here is perhaps an allegory of humanity stumbling along, not being helped by a set of abstract beliefs such as Christianity.
N'allez pas croire que je sois venu sur la terre pour apporter la paix. Je ne suis pas venu sur la terre pour apporter la paix, mais le glaive.
Seigneur, un oiseau vient de passer, je l'ai reconnu au bruit des ailes.
Shh. It's kind of open-ending. It's not that emphatic statement on Christianity that some people took it to be. Rather, it's going in different directions, I think. And of course, that's exactly what you'd expect at the end of the 1960s. This is a time of profound social upheaval and turmoil. And I think Buñuel is reflecting some of that tremendous uncertainty that gripped the whole of Europe at that time, and America, as people questioned their most basic beliefs and tried to look for a new way forward. It's not a film about giving answers. It's a film about casting doubt on all the answers we've had, and even pointing towards the need for a new way forward, which is where I think our two pilgrims are left at the end of the film.